I've been supporting my brother financially for 6 years. I accidentally saw a text on his phone that read, "She has no idea how much we've saved." His wife replied, "Keep it that way until we're gone." I confronted them both and blew everything wide open. The text was still glowing on the screen when my hands went cold. I hadn't meant to look. Owen had asked me to grab his phone from the kitchen counter and check the time on a delivery notification he was expecting. Something about a package from an outdoor gear company. I'd picked it up, the screen had lit from the motion sensor, and the message thread was already open, already visible, already burning itself into the back of my eyes before I could process what I was reading. 3 seconds? Maybe 4. That's all it took to undo 6 years of my life. The text was from Petra. His wife, sent at 2:13 in the afternoon, while Owen and I were sitting in his living room talking about nothing, talking about the good old days, talking about our parents' anniversary coming up next month. And her message, typed quickly, casually, the way you type to someone who already knows the secret you're keeping, said, "She has no idea how much we've saved. Honestly, I can't believe it's worked this long." Owen's reply sent 11 minutes earlier was equally casual. "She never asks for receipts, never checks anything, just keeps sending." And Petra's response, the one that arrived while I was sitting 10 feet away, being the generous, trusting, devoted sister who had quietly dismantled her own financial security over the past 6 years to keep her brother afloat. "Keep it that way until we're gone." Gone. I stood in that kitchen holding my brother's phone with the fluorescent light humming above me, and I felt the particular, specific silence that comes right before something enormous collapses. I set the phone back on the counter, screen down. I walked back into the living room. I sat down. And I smiled at my brother, gone, until they were gone. I needed to know everything before I said a single word. I had been 26 years old when Owen called me crying, from a rest stop somewhere outside of Columbus. He'd been laid off. His company, a mid-sized logistics firm where he'd worked as an operations manager, had done a round of cuts that nobody saw coming, and Owen's entire department was eliminated in a single Friday afternoon email. He was 31. He and Petra had been married for 2 years. They'd bought a house the year before, a 3-bedroom craftsman in a suburb of Cleveland that they'd gotten at what Owen called a steal, though I remember thinking the mortgage seemed steep for 2 people at their income level. He'd never asked me for money before that call. Not once. Our parents had raised us to be independent to the point of stubbornness, and asking for help felt to both of us like admitting defeat. So when he called me sobbing, voice cracking in a way I hadn't heard since we were kids, I didn't hesitate. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. I was a project coordinator at an architecture firm in Chicago. I made decent money for my age, not exceptional, but enough that I could absorb a hit. I told him I'd send $1,500 a month until he found something new. He told me he'd pay it back. He said 3 months. Maybe 4. The job market was brutal, but he had connections. He had experience. He had a solid resume. He was going to be fine. He was always going to be fine. That was October 6 years ago. The 3 months became 6. The 6 became a year. And somewhere in that first year, the story evolved. Owen hadn't found work. Petra's hours at her dental office had been cut. The house needed repairs. A pipe burst in February and insurance covered half. Owen's car needed a new transmission. They'd had to dip into their emergency fund. The emergencies kept coming. And I kept saying yes, because that's what you do for family. Because Owen was my little brother, and I remembered teaching him to ride a bike in our parents' driveway, and I could not watch him lose his house. I could not be the person who let that happen. So I increased the monthly transfer to $2,000. Then, after Petra was allegedly diagnosed with a thyroid condition that required specialist visits and medication their insurance didn't fully cover, I increased it again. $2,500 a month. Every month for 6 years. $180,000. I did the math in my car, parked in Owen's driveway, pretending to look at my own phone while actually opening the calculator app. My hands were steadier than they had any right to be. $180,000 over 72 months. That number sat in the pit of my stomach like a stone dropped into deep water. I drained my own savings account down to almost nothing in year 3, when my company did its own round of restructuring and I took a pay cut. I'd put off buying an apartment, living in a rental with 2 roommates longer than I'd planned because I didn't have enough for a down payment anymore. I'd said no to a trip to Portugal with my college friends because I couldn't afford it. I'd passed on a graduate program in urban planning because the tuition felt irresponsible given my financial situation. All of it, every single sacrifice, had felt worth it because I believed in the story. I believed in Owen standing at that rest stop in October, crying because he was scared and overwhelmed and needed his big sister. I believed in that man completely. But Petra's text was still burning behind my eyelids. She has no idea how much we've saved. The key word was saved, not spent, not used for bills or groceries or medical copays or transmission repairs. Saved. They had been saving it. And I sat in my car for 22 minutes before I went back inside and told Owen I needed to get on the road before traffic got bad. He hugged me at the door. He smelled like the same soap he'd used since college. He said, "Thanks for coming, Lydia. You're the best. You know that, right?" I said, "I know." I drove 45 minutes before I pulled over at a gas station and finally let my hands shake as much as they wanted. The first thing I did when I got home was open my laptop. I'm not proud of what came next in terms of method, but I'm also not ashamed of it. I've been sending Owen money through a direct bank transfer every month, always on the first, always with a note in the memo line that said something like monthly support or, embarrassingly, love you. I logged into my bank's transfer portal and I looked at the records. 6 years of transfers. Every single one documented with a timestamp, a confirmation number, and the recipient account information. I screenshotted every page. Then I opened a separate document and started a timeline, writing down everything I could remember about each financial emergency Owen had described over the years. The layoff, the pipe, the transmission, the thyroid diagnosis, Petra's reduced hours, Owen's freelance work that never quite panned out, a medical bill from a procedure in year 4 that Owen mentioned once and never brought up again. I had no way of verifying any of these stories. I realized, sitting there with my laptop screen reflecting in my glasses at 11 o'clock at night, that I had never once asked for documentation. Not a single invoice, not a hospital bill, not a pay stub or a bank statement showing their deficit. I had asked my brother once, early on, if he wanted to walk me through his budget so we could figure out a realistic support amount. He'd gotten quiet in a way that felt like embarrassment, and I'd immediately backed off because I didn't want to humiliate him. I was protecting his dignity. Now I understood I had been protecting his con. The next morning I called my friend Renata, who worked in banking compliance and had a habit of knowing things most people didn't. I told her I needed advice. She asked what kind. I said the kind where someone might have been lying to me about their finances for a long time. There was a beat of silence, and then Renata said, "Come over Saturday, I'll make coffee and you can tell me everything." Renata listened to all of it without interrupting, which is one of the reasons I've kept her as a close friend for 15 years. When I finished, she set down her coffee mug and looked at me with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and urgency. "Lydia," she said carefully, "if what you saw in that text is accurate, what they've been doing has a name. It's called financial fraud by deception. The fact that you transferred money based on false pretenses, that's legally meaningful." I told her I didn't know if I wanted to go legal. I told her I wasn't sure about anything yet. I needed to know what I was actually dealing with before I decided on a direction. Renata nodded slowly. "Then you need a forensic accountant," she said. "Someone who can trace where your money actually went. If they've been saving it, it went somewhere. Bank accounts, investments, property. Well, money doesn't just disappear." She gave me the name of someone she trusted, Neil Ibarra, an independent forensic accountant who specialized in financial fraud cases and had 15 years of experience working with both law firms and private individuals. He'd testified as an expert witness in 3 federal cases. I called him Monday morning. He agreed to an initial consultation for a flat fee of $300, and when I sat across from him at his office downtown 2 days later and explained the situation, he leaned back in his chair and laced his fingers together with the expression of someone who had heard variations of this story before. "The first thing I need," he said, "is your bank records, every transfer, every date, every amount. And then I need whatever information you can legally obtain about their financial accounts, property records, business registrations, anything in the public domain." He paused. "Do you have any access to their accounts? Joint accounts? Shared passwords? Anything like that?" I said no. He nodded like that was the expected answer. "Then we start with what's public," he said. "You'd be surprised what you can find before you ever subpoena anything." Neil Ibarra was meticulous. That's the word that kept coming to me during our weekly check-ins over the following 3 weeks. Meticulous. He pulled property records for Owen and Petra's home address and found something that hadn't been on my radar. The house had been refinanced 18 months ago. Cash-out refinance. They'd pulled $62,000 in equity out of the property. I asked Neil what that meant practically. He looked at me steadily. "It means they had equity built up, which is normal in a rising market. But combined with what you've been sending them, they should have had significant cash reserves unless they were spending every dollar on actual living expenses." The county property records also showed that Owen and Petra owned a second property, a condo in Clearwater, Florida, purchased 14 months ago for $208,000. The deed was in Petra's name. I sat very still when Neil showed me the printout. "Gone," I said quietly. Neil looked up. "What?" "Something someone said to me," I told him. "Keep it that way until we're gone." He held my gaze for a moment. "I think," he said carefully, "that you should talk to a lawyer." I was already dialing by the time I got back to my car. Diana Rowell had been practicing civil litigation for 19 years, and she had an office that smelled like cedar and old paper books, which I found oddly reassuring the first time I walked in. She had the kind of calm that suggested she had seen situations much worse than mine, and had won most of them. I laid out everything I had: the bank transfer records, the screenshots, the property records Neil had compiled, and a written account of the text I'd seen on Owen's phone, typed up as precisely as I could remember, timestamped to the minute. Diana read through everything without speaking, and when she finished, she removed her reading glasses and set them on top of the stack of papers. "You have a civil fraud claim," she said simply. "Fraudulent misrepresentation? You transferred money in reliance on false statements your brother made about his financial situation. If we can demonstrate those statements were knowingly false, you have grounds to recover." I asked what that recovery could look like. "Compensatory damages, meaning the money you actually lost. In some cases, punitive damages on top of that, depending on the court and the degree of intentional deception." She paused. "The Florida property's interesting. It suggests they've been planning this for some time. The refinance equity, the condo purchase, the fact that the condo is in Petra's name alone, this looks like asset positioning. They may have been planning to relocate and sever contact." I thought of Petra's text again. "Keep it that way until we're gone." "How long would this take?" I asked. Diana looked at me evenly. "Litigation is slow, but we can start with a demand letter, which puts them on notice and sometimes produces faster results. And depending on what Neil's full accounting uncovers, there may be grounds for a criminal referral." The word criminal sat in the air between us like something with weight. I nodded. "Start with the demand letter," I said, "but don't hold back." Meanwhile, I was still maintaining the surface. Owen texted me, occasionally, A meme here, a funny video there, the kind of casual sibling contact that costs nothing and used to make me smile. Now every notification from him made something in my chest tighten. I answered normally. I sent laughing emojis. I did not tell him what I knew. I also did not send the first of the month transfer. I waited to see if he'd notice. 4 days after the first, Owen called. His voice was warm and slightly apologetic in the way he always sounded when asking for something. Hey, Lydia, so I haven't seen the transfer hit yet. Everything okay on your end? I told him I'd had some banking issues and it might be delayed a day or two. He said, oh, no worries, just checking. There was zero concern in his voice, not a flicker of worry that I might be struggling. No offer to skip a month, no suggestion that maybe they could cover it this time. He just said no worries and then asked if I'd seen the new series everyone was talking about. That call told me everything I hadn't been able to confirm from the texts and property records alone. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't desperate. He was managing a schedule. I was a line item. My brother had turned me into a recurring revenue stream, and he called me to follow up on late payments with the same mild concern a person might feel about a delayed grocery delivery. I hung up and sat on my bathroom floor for a while, not crying, just sitting, processing the specific texture of being that wrong about someone you love. Neil delivered his full report on a Thursday morning, 21 days after our initial meeting. He'd expanded his search with my authorization to include business registrations, and I hadn't known Owen had a business registration. Owen had registered an LLC in Ohio 14 months ago, the same month the Florida condo was purchased. The LLC was listed as a consulting firm. Its registered agent was Petra. Neil had also found, through legal public database searches, that Owen had a brokerage account opened 3 years earlier. He couldn't access the account balance without a subpoena, but the account's existence was a matter of public record through a regulatory filing. 3 years. He'd opened an investment account 3 years into the 6-year scheme. I kept coming back to the word scheme in my head even though I'd been resisting it, because using that word meant accepting that my brother had sat across from me at holiday dinners and birthday lunches and family funerals for 6 years and looked me in the eye while running a deliberate financial fraud against me. Using the word scheme meant accepting that the crying man at the Ohio rest stop had either been entirely genuine in his initial panic and then made a calculated decision at some point to weaponize my empathy, or had planned from the beginning to use the crisis as a long-term extraction mechanism. Yes, I didn't know which was worse. Neil presented his findings in a 12-page report with accompanying spreadsheets and highlighted exhibits. He estimated conservatively, based on available public data and the pattern of transfers, that Owen and Petra had diverted between $90,000 and $120,000 of what I'd sent them into savings and investment instruments, while using the remainder on actual living expenses. He was careful to caveat that this was an estimate pending access to their actual accounts, but even the conservative floor of that estimate, $90,000, sat in my chest like a physical thing. Diana Rowell received the report electronically within the hour. She called me that afternoon. We have enough to proceed, she said. Are you ready? The demand letter went out on a Friday afternoon via certified mail and email simultaneously. Diana had drafted it with the precise, controlled language of someone who knew exactly how much pressure to apply. It laid out the factual basis of the claim, the 6 years of transfers, the total amount, the evidence of financial misrepresentation, the Florida property, the LLC, the investment account. It demanded full accounting of how the transferred funds had been used, repayment of any funds not used for the stated purposes, and a response within 15 days. It also noted in language that Diana described as deliberate, that failure to respond or respond truthfully would result in referral to law enforcement for consideration of criminal fraud charges. Owen called me 4 hours after the letter was delivered. He didn't mention the letter. He called as if it were a normal call, his voice a shade too casual, asking if I was around this weekend, if maybe I wanted to come over for dinner. I felt something shift inside me, the last frail thread of the version of him I'd believed in snapping quietly. I told him I was busy this weekend. He said, no worries, soon then, and got off the phone in under 2 minutes. 20 minutes later, Petra called from her own number, something she had never done in 6 years. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail that lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds, and I listened to it twice, taking notes. She said there had been a misunderstanding. She said things weren't what they looked like. She said she and Owen cared about me deeply, and they hoped we could handle this as a family before things got complicated. She did not deny the Florida condo. She did not deny the LLC. She did not explain the investment account. She said specifically that they had been planning to tell me about their improved financial situation when the time was right, when they were more settled. I forwarded the voicemail to Diana. Diana wrote back within the hour. This voicemail is gold. She's implicitly acknowledging that they withheld material financial information while continuing to accept transfers. That's intentional deception under the statute. She also noted something I hadn't caught on my own. Petra had said, when we were more settled? Future tense. They were still planning to leave. The 15-day response window closed on a Wednesday afternoon. Owen and Petra's attorney, a man named Gregory Falk who practiced out of a small firm in Cleveland, sent a 4-page letter that was essentially a masterpiece of saying nothing. It acknowledged receipt of our demand. It disputed the characterization of the situation as fraudulent. It offered a vague counter-narrative about Owen having found some independent income sources over the past few years that he had chosen to invest as a matter of financial responsibility, without any obligation to disclose to family members. It suggested that Lydia's transfers had been made as gifts without expectation of reciprocal disclosure. It proposed a mediated discussion. Diana read it and then sent me an email with a single line. They have no defense and they know it. Filing next week. I asked her if there was anything I should do in the meantime. She said, document everything you have access to, and don't confront them directly yet. so let the legal process do the confronting. I tried. I really tried. I held out for 6 more days. It was a Sunday evening when I finally drove to Owen's house. I hadn't told Diana. I hadn't told Renata. I sat in my car outside for 11 minutes, watching the light in their front window, the blue flicker of the television, the ordinary suburban evening of a couple who had decided, at some point, that I was a resource to be managed rather than a sister to be loved. I went to the door. Petra answered. She was in a loose sweater and socks, and for one disorienting second she looked like a completely normal person, like someone's wife on a Sunday evening. Oh, and the cognitive dissonance of that image, this ordinary-looking woman who had texted her husband that his sister had no idea how much they'd saved, was so sharp that I had to actively ground myself in what I knew to be true. "Lydia," she said. Her voice was carefully neutral. "Owen," she called over her shoulder. "Lydia's here." Owen appeared from the kitchen doorway with the expression of a man who had been preparing for this conversation for 6 days and thought he was ready for it. He was not ready for it. I stepped inside without being invited, which is not something I normally do. I sat down on their couch. I looked at them both standing there in their living room, and I said, "I saw the text." Owen's expression didn't change. Petra's did. A small, involuntary tightening around her eyes, there and gone, in under a second. But I caught it. "What text?" Owen said, with the particular casualness of someone buying time. "The one where you told your wife that I had no idea how much you'd saved," I said. "And she told you to keep it that way until you were gone." The room was very quiet. The television was still playing something in the background, a home improvement show, someone demoing a wall with a sledgehammer. "Lydia," Owen started. I held up my hand. "I have the bank records. I have the property records. I have the condo in Clearwater in Petra's name. I have the LLC. I have the investment account." I watched the blood drain out of Petra's face. Owen had gone very still. "I have a forensic accountant's report and a civil litigation attorney who filed a fraud claim against you 3 days ago." That wasn't entirely accurate. Diana hadn't filed yet, but it landed correctly. Owen sat down heavily in the armchair across from me. He looked suddenly much older than 37. Petra remained standing, and I could see her recalibrating, could see her deciding what version of this to try. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said. It was possibly the worst thing she could have said. "It wasn't supposed to be like what?" My voice was steady, eerily steady, even to my own ears. I didn't feel calm. I felt the way you feel in the first seconds after a car accident, before the pain registers, hyper-alert, hyper-clear, processing everything at a slightly unreal speed. "We were going to pay it back," Owen said. His voice had changed. The casual warmth was gone. What was left underneath was something I didn't recognize in my brother, raw, exhausted defeat. "We were going to pay all of it back, Lydia, I swear. Once the condo appreciated and we sold it, once the investments matured, we had a plan." "A plan," I repeated. "You had a plan that you were going to execute while I had no idea any of it existed." He didn't answer that. Because there was no answer that made it better. "Why didn't you just tell me you were doing better?" I heard my voice change slightly on that question. Not breaking, but shifting. Because that was the question underneath everything, the one that had been sitting in me since the gas station parking lot when my hands shook on the steering wheel. "Why not just say, Lydia, we're getting back on our feet. You can stop sending money?" Owen looked at me, and I saw something move across his face that I wanted to believe was shame. "Because you would have stopped," he said quietly. And there it was. The whole thing, in one sentence. I would have stopped. They needed me not to stop, so they kept the story going, kept me in the dark, kept me in the role of the generous older sister who asked no questions and required no accountability until they had what they needed and could disappear to Florida. I stood up. "I came here to say one thing," I told them. "Whatever you were planning to do, the condo, the investments, the LLC, the plan to be gone, it's done. My attorney filed this week. Neil Ibarra's report is part of the record. Anything you try to do with those assets before this is resolved will be considered dissipation of funds pending litigation." That last phrase was Diana's, and I had practiced saying it in my car for 5 minutes before going to the door. I turned and walked out. Petra called my name. I didn't stop. Owen didn't call after me at all. Diana was not entirely pleased that I'd gone to the house. She said it on the phone Monday morning with the measured patience of someone who had also seen this happen before. "I understand why you did it," she said. "I'm not going to pretend I don't, but from this point forward all contact goes through me. If they reach out to you directly, you forward it to me and say nothing." I agreed. I also told her what Owen had said. The plan to pay it back, the investment strategy, the implied intention to eventually make it right before disappearing to Florida. Diana was quiet for a moment. "That's actually useful," she said. "It suggests they never intended this to be a permanent theft. They may have genuinely planned to repay it, but intention doesn't erase the deception or the harm, and it definitely doesn't erase the 6 years of fraudulent misrepresentation that preceded it." She filed the civil suit that Wednesday. The complaint was 31 pages. It named Owen and Petra as co-defendants. It listed the fraud claim, a claim for unjust enrichment, and requested injunctive relief to prevent them from disposing of or transferring assets, specifically the Florida condo and the investment accounts, while the case was pending. Gregory Falk responded within 48 hours requesting a meeting. Diana scheduled it for the following Friday in her office. I sat on one side of Diana's conference table, Owen and Petra on the other, Falk beside them in a suit that looked like it had been pressed that morning, specifically for the purpose of projecting confidence. I watched my brother for the first hour without speaking. He looked exhausted. Petra looked controlled. Falk went through an opening position that involved the word gift approximately 11 times, and the phrase family misunderstanding approximately 8. Diana dismantled each argument so efficiently and quietly that I found myself almost feeling sorry for Falk, who had probably had easier cases in his career. The meeting lasted 3 hours. No resolution was reached, but at the end, as we were gathering our materials, Owen looked across the table at me and said, in a voice that had nothing performative left in it, "I'm sorry, Lydia. I mean that." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about the phone call from the rest stop. I thought about 6 years of transfers and 6 years of stories and 6 years of being the sister who showed up and never asked for anything in return. "I know you do," I said, "but sorry doesn't give me back the graduate program I didn't go to." I picked up my bag and walked out. Sergeant Frank Okafor of the County Financial Crimes Unit had 17 years of experience, and he had a handshake that made you immediately believe he was both competent and fair. Diana had suggested filing a criminal complaint alongside the civil suit, not necessarily because she expected it to result in charges, but because it would add a layer of institutional pressure and create a formal record. Sergeant Okafor met with Diana and me in a conference room at the precinct on a Monday morning with a yellow legal pad and a recording device he placed on the table with a brief explanation of procedure. He asked me to walk him through the entire situation from the beginning. I did. He asked clarifying questions, specific ones, the exact wording of the text message as I remembered it, the dates of the transfers, my level of knowledge about Owen and Petra's financial situation at each point. He had Neil Ibarra's report in front of him before the meeting was over, Diana having sent it over the previous day. "I want to be honest with you, Ms. Thorne," he said at the end, folding his hands on the legal pad. "Criminal fraud in a family financial situation is difficult to prosecute. The defense will argue gifts, will argue lack of criminal intent, will point to the stated intent to repay, but," he added with emphasis that felt deliberate, "the documented pattern of deception, the concealment of assets, and especially the suggestion in the voicemail that they intended to leave the state before disclosure, those are factors that give this complaint more teeth than average. I'm going to open a formal inquiry." He looked at me directly. "That means they'll be contacted. They'll know we're involved." I told him I understood. He nodded and made a note on his legal pad. Walking out of the precinct in the cold November morning, Diana said quietly, "This is going well. Oh, better than I expected at this stage." I told her I wasn't feeling good about any of it. She looked at me with something that wasn't quite sympathy, but was adjacent to it. "You're not supposed to feel good," she said. "You're supposed to feel like you're doing something. That's what this is." The news of the civil suit became semi-public when it hit the county courthouse filings database, which is accessible to anyone who knows where to look. I hadn't anticipated this. I should have, but I didn't. I found out it had become public when my Aunt Delia called me on a Wednesday evening and said she'd heard something was happening with Owen, and could I please tell her what was going on. I told Delia I wasn't in a position to discuss it. She said she understood. Then my cousin Raymond called. Then my mother's best friend Vera called, also ostensibly to check on me, but actually in the way of people who can't quite contain themselves, to see if what she'd heard was true. I didn't call my parents. That conversation had been living in my mind like a storm cloud since this whole thing began, and I wasn't ready for it. My mother loved Owen with the specific, slightly blinding love that parents sometimes have for a child who struggled more, who needed more, who seemed in some fundamental way more vulnerable. She was going to take this badly. I knew that. But I also knew that she had probably been part of the story Owen told me, had probably reinforced the narrative about his financial difficulties without knowing it was theater. My parents hadn't been in on it. I was certain of that, but they had been props, used to make the story more credible. Owen had once mentioned, during a call where he was updating me on their situation, that Mom was so worried about them. That Mom had offered to send money, but they told her not to, that they couldn't take money from their parents at their age. It made me feel good at the time, like we were protecting our parents together. Now I understood it differently. He'd been telling me that story to reinforce my role, to remind me that I was the one who could help, the one who should help, the one whose help was most needed and most welcome. It was elegant in a way that made me feel sick to acknowledge. Owen was not stupid. He had played this with precision. My mother called me on a Thursday evening 3 weeks into the litigation, which told me Owen had finally told them something. Her voice was careful and soft in the way it gets when she's trying not to cry. "Lydia, sweetheart, Dad and I heard from Owen. He said there's something going on between you two, a legal matter." I sat down on my couch and braced myself. "There is," I said. "It's serious, and I want to tell you everything, but I need you to listen all the way through before you respond." She said she would. I told her everything, every transfer, every month, every fabricated emergency. I told her about the condo and the LLC and the investment account. I told her about the text I'd seen on Owen's phone. I told her about Sergeant Okafor and Diana Rowell and Neil Ibarra's report. My mother was silent through all of it. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then she said, "Oh, Lydia." Just that. Not Owen's name, mine. I felt something crack open in my chest, and she said, "Your father and I are going to get on a plane." I told her she didn't have to do that. She said, "We're getting on a plane." They arrived that Saturday. My father sat at my kitchen table reading Neil's report from beginning to end with his reading glasses on and his jaw set in a line I recognized from my childhood as controlled anger. My mother held my hand at the kitchen table and cried quietly. Not for Owen. For me. For the 6 years. For the graduate program and the apartment and the Portugal trip and every other thing that had been quietly, incrementally stolen by a man who knew I would never stop saying yes as long as the story was sad enough. My father finished the report, removed his glasses, and said in a tone I had never heard from him before, "We are going to fix this." He meant it. I knew he meant it. But I also knew that there are some things that get fixed on paper and remain broken in the chest, and this was one of them. The mediation was Diana's idea, and she sold it to me on the grounds of speed and control. Litigation, she explained, could take 2 to 3 years, cost both parties substantial money in attorney's fees, and produce an unpredictable outcome depending on the judge and the defense's ability to argue gift versus loan. Mediation, if Owen and Petra were willing to participate, could produce a binding settlement agreement in a fraction of the time. They were willing. I suspected Gregory Falk had told them they were unlikely to win at trial. Sergeant Okafor's inquiry was an additional pressure point. The mediation was scheduled for a Friday in December, held in a neutral conference space downtown with a mediator named Harold Kwame, a retired judge who specialized in complex civil settlements and came recommended by Diana as someone with no patience for games. Owen and Petra came with Falk. My parents, to my surprise, asked if they could attend. Diana checked the rules and confirmed they could observe but not participate. They sat behind me, my father with his hands folded, my mother with her coat in her lap. Owen arrived in a suit I'd never seen him wear. He looked like he hadn't slept properly in weeks. Petra arrived looking precise and unreadable, which I found more disturbing than distress would have been. Harold Kwame opened proceedings with a calm, comprehensive explanation of the process and its binding nature if an agreement was reached. He looked at both sides of the table with the equanimity of someone who had watched a great many difficult truths surface in this particular room. He then asked Owen to make an opening statement. Owen cleared his throat. He looked down at the table. He said in a voice that was much quieter than I expected, "What we did was wrong. I know that. I've known it for a while. I told myself it was temporary, that the plan would make it right eventually, but there is no version of that story that makes it okay. Lydia trusted me completely, and I used that trust." He stopped. Petra put her hand on his arm. He looked up at me. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know that's not enough. I know there's nothing I can say that makes 6 years okay. But I need you to know that I never stopped knowing it was you. Well, I never stopped knowing what you were giving up for us. I just kept telling myself it would be worth it in the end." I listened to all of that very carefully. I'd been preparing myself for many different versions of this meeting. Defensive versions, combative versions, Petra controlling the narrative versions. I hadn't fully prepared for my brother sounding genuinely broken. I had prepared a statement. Diana had advised to keeping it brief and factual. I told myself I would stick to what we'd planned. I looked at Owen and then at Petra, and I said, 6 years ago, you called me crying from a rest stop in Ohio. I said yes before you finished asking because you are my brother, and I would have done anything for you. I gave you $180,000 because I believed you needed it. I made choices about my own life based on the belief that I needed to prioritize your survival over my opportunities. I didn't ask questions because I was trying to preserve your dignity. I trusted you completely, and you looked me in the eye at every holiday and birthday and family event for 6 years and said nothing. That is what I need you to understand. Not just the money, the years. I can't have those back." Harold Kwame gave everyone a moment before moving to the practical portion. The negotiation took 4 hours, conducted in alternating private sessions. Kwame meeting with our side, then theirs, shuttling offers back and forth. The final settlement agreement included full repayment of the amount Neil Abar had estimated as diverted, $108,000, to be paid from the sale proceeds of the Florida condo, which Falk confirmed had current market value sufficient to cover the amount with equity remaining. It also included a formal written acknowledgement of the deception, structured as a legal document, not a personal apology, which Diana had insisted on because it created an official record. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue punitive damages, and Diana agreed to recommend to Sergeant Okafor that the criminal inquiry be closed, pending fulfillment of the civil settlement. Harold Kwame presented the final terms at the end of the afternoon. I looked at the number on the page. $108,000. Not the full 180. Not the graduate program. Not the years. But real, documented, legally enforceable. I signed it. Owen signed it. Petra signed it without looking at me. My father, from his chair against the wall, Hook let out a long, quiet breath. The Florida condo sold 11 weeks later. Diana received the funds directly into her client trust account per the settlement terms. She called me when the transfer cleared, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a completed case. "It's done," she said. "The full amount is here. I'll wire your portion after fees today." I thanked her. She said, "You did well. You could have come apart at any of about 15 different points in this process, and you didn't." I told her I'd come apart privately on my own time. She laughed, which surprised me. It was a genuine laugh, not a professional one. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment, my rental apartment with the 2 roommates I still had because I'd never recovered the savings for a down payment, and I felt something that wasn't quite happiness and wasn't quite relief. It was more like the particular exhaustion of a very long storm finally being past. The money hit my account the next morning. $108,000, minus Diana's fees and Neil Abar's invoices, which together came to approximately $14,000. $94,000, landing in an account that had been quietly hollowed out for 6 years. It was not $180,000. It was not everything. But it was real, and it was mine, and no one had given it to me out of sympathy or obligation. I had taken it back. 3 months later, I put down a deposit on a 2-bedroom apartment in the Wicker Park neighborhood. It was more than I could have afforded the year before, and less than I would have liked, and exactly right for where I was. Renata helped me move in on a Saturday with boxed wine and a truck she borrowed from her brother-in-law. My parents came up from Ohio, and my father assembled furniture with the focused intensity of a man who needed to do something useful, and my mother arranged kitchen cabinets with the care of someone making a home for someone she loved. I called the urban planning program I'd passed on 2 years before and asked if they had any information about the next application cycle. They did. I applied in January, I heard back in March. I was starting in the fall. I did not call Owen. He called me once, about 2 months after the settlement. Oh, from a number I didn't recognize. I answered by accident. He said, "Lydia." I said, "I know it's you." There was a pause. "I wanted to know if you were okay," he said. "I am," I told him. "Are you?" Another pause. "We sold the condo," he said. "We're staying in Cleveland for now." "I know," I said, because I did. I didn't ask how they were doing. He didn't ask about the apartment or the program or anything else about my life. We didn't have much left to say that didn't cost something. We said goodbye, and I hung up and I did not cry. I had cried enough. There's a photo on my bookshelf now. Owen and me at our parents' house, maybe 15 years ago, the summer after he graduated high school. We're both laughing about something. Be leaning into each other the way siblings do when the trust between them is complete and unexamined and feels like it will always be there. I kept the photo, not because I've forgiven him, though I think someday I might. I kept it because that boy was real. The laughing summer version of my brother who hadn't yet made the choices that would dismantle us. He was real, and he was someone I loved, and erasing him from my shelves would mean pretending he'd never existed, which would be its own kind of lie. I've had enough of lies. I'm building a life on what's actually true now. It's slower, it costs more, it fits better, and nobody gets to keep it from me but me.